A quick break for a word from our sponsors.
They were some of the most powerful men who've ever lived. They waged war, forged peace, and altered the fates of billions of people. And yet, they were just as human, just as flawed as you and me. They were the presidents of the United States, and they are the subjects of the history podcast, This American President. In each episode of This American President, we explore how flawed men have managed this awesome responsibility. To listen now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search This American President on your favorite podcast platform.
20 years ago, you wrote a book about how Churchill wrote his 6-volume memoirs and the editorial choices he made because he was consciously crafting and shaping his legacy. But you compared the final version of the memoir to an earlier draft, and you noted the differences in which Churchill is censoring himself in order not to offend others because he's depending on their goodwill. Can you tell me about the differences between these two versions and how it led you to write another volume, your current book on the leaders who shaped Churchill?
The book I wrote 20 years ago was really a close examination of Churchill's 6 volumes of war memoirs, Second World War memoirs, which have shaped our understanding of the war. So it was in very much document closely examining archives and how Churchill used them. This book, Mirrors of Greatness, is a very different kind of book because what I'm doing is looking at the whole of Churchill's life and illuminating it, I hope, through key individuals, key leaders that he dealt with, and trying to show how if we piece them together from the beginning of his life with his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, right through to the end, to his wife and his family, I think we get a different view of Churchill because he is often thought of as a standalone, self-made man, a genius standing on almost a solitary peak. And in many ways, there's truth in that, as contemporaries recognize, but there's also truth in the way that he learnt from others, particularly other leaders. And that's what Mirrors of Greatness is trying to bring out.
Let's start off with his relationship with his father. Winston traveled far and wide as a young man, and he worked ferociously hard to make his mark on life. Even though he came from a privileged background, and one would assume looking at this that this wouldn't be necessary, but he still does this. And I think this can largely be owed to the relationship with his father, Lord Randolph, who disdains his son, he disapproves of him. Can you discuss this, and how do you see this influencing him?
I think it was a profound influence. Churchill really yearned for his father's approval. Lord Randolph adopted an aloof, censorious tone towards Winston. He regarded him as a wastrel at school, lack of application, and so on. He made that very clear in letters that he wrote. And Churchill's hopes of redeeming his reputation with his father, maybe by playing a part in Lord Randolph's long political career, were brought to nothing. First, because Lord Randolph's long political career turned into nothing itself. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 5 months in 1886 and then disappeared from the political scene because he had the temerity to take on the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury. So Randolph was in the wilderness, and then within another decade, he died, Winston believed probably of syphilis, so that in his mid-40s, Lord Randolph was dead, and Winston's idea of working with his father completely disappeared. And there was a sense of a huge missed opportunity throughout Winston's life. And one of his close friends, or the woman who in many ways would have liked to have married him and never did, Violet Asquith, as she then was, the daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister before the First World War, she wrote at the end of Winston's life, after his death, she wrote, "Until the end, he worshipped at the altar of his unknown father." Very poignant words. And I think there's truth in that. So that unknown father that he worshipped was a kind of leading light throughout Winston's career. Almost he was trying to live up to the father that had condemned him when he was young.
Another relationship in which Winston is the junior, he's subordinate and not equal, is David Lloyd George, who's the prime minister from 1916 to 1922. During the First World War, Winston is the Lord of the Admiralty, most famously loses the Battle of Gallipoli, leading later to his years in the political wilderness. But this aspect of his relationship with George isn't known as well. So could you describe this and the influence it has on him?
Yes, so Winston, like his father, Lord Randolph, was a Tory, a conservative. But at the beginning of the 20th century, he changed parties towards the Liberals. His father had been an exponent of what was called Tory democracy, a sort of democratizing of the Conservative Party. And Winston felt that the Liberals were now a better exemplar of Tory democracy than the Conservative Party was. And when he changed parties, the person who adopted him, and he certainly latched onto, was the rising star of the new liberalism, Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, a Welsh radical, a remarkable orator with a really brilliant tongue and a brilliant improvisational tongue in a way that Winston never had. And he became Churchill's mentor, and they worked very closely together in the Liberal government before the First World War. And there was always a sense that Winston felt that Lloyd George was the senior partner. In the 1920s, long after Lloyd George had lost office as Prime Minister, Churchill referred to their relationship continuing in the 1920s as a relationship between master and servant, and I was the servant. And Lloyd George always had an admiration for Churchill's skills, but he made one of the most telling comments about Churchill to do with the question of Churchill's judgment. And he put it rather quaintly of Churchill: his steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. His steering gear is too weak for his horsepower. That tremendous energy, but could it be regulated? Could it be guided in safe ways? That was the big question for British politicians, not just in the era of Lloyd George and the First World War, but for much of Churchill's political career.
At this point, usually people jump from Churchill's early life to his wartime years, but somebody who spans that bridge is his wife, Clementine. And many writers note that she was Winston's peer in many ways. I think sometimes there's a tendency for biographers to always make political spouses the peer of the subject in question, and that from the perspective of American history, every first lady is the peer of a particular president, which I think is definitely not the case, but in some cases it is, with the Abigail Adamses of the world, and someone would make the same point with Clementine Churchill. So could you describe this dynamic and how you see her influence over the years?
They fell passionately in love in 1908. They married quickly. It was a very intense marriage. She recognized from the beginning that this man had a real sense of his own destiny. It was a sense that she shared, a conviction that she shared, and she recognized, as she said, that Winston was going to be her life's work. But she was a very talented woman in her own right and a very independent-minded person, very gifted in languages, particularly French, might have gone to university had her family not been of the lower aristocracy and were too snobbish to imagine their daughter going to university. She was a bit of a blue stocking, as they would say in those days. She sacrificed a good deal of that because of Winston, but she applied her very sharp mind to helping him to develop his skills. She read many of his drafts of his speeches, of his books. She commented very directly on what she thought was good and what was bad. She was somebody who gave him also a sense of calmness and conviction. He was an immensely volatile person, and she managed to just keep him on a steady keel, as you might say. Because he was such a volatile person, they learned fairly early on to have separate bedrooms. The idea of Winston 24 hours a day was just too much for her. And indeed, whenever he was away, particularly during the Second World War on wartime conferences, she would go off to a rest cure to just recover. So huge cost to her. But also, I think Churchill actually gave her some opportunities. And it's particularly striking that in the Second World War, he put her in charge of the aid to Russia, humanitarian aid to Russia program for Britain's Russian allies who were doing so much of the land fighting. And she raised a huge amount of money with the help of British children, families, and so on, for hospitals in Soviet Union and so on. And she visited the Soviet Union in April 1945, was welcomed by Stalin at the Kremlin, by Molotov, the foreign minister, toured the country just at the time when Churchill was really falling out with Stalin. So there was an interesting kind of contrast there that their lives came together. But she recognized that she would never have had opportunities like that but for being married to Winston. So it was a complicated relationship, one in which she had to sacrifice a lot, but she gained a lot from the marriage as well.
When Churchill returns from the political wilderness in the 1930s, in this chapter in his life, what he's most praised for is his public opposition to Adolf Hitler, which wasn't typical in the 1930s among British politicians. They saw him as a bulwark against communism in Europe. And it's not that he particularly disdained fascism. He liked things about Mussolini, as we'll discuss later, but disliked Hitler particularly. Also, he disliked Mahatma Gandhi for his threat against the British Empire, but what he saw as being an opportunistic upper-class person who was pretending to be an Indian peasant in his way he publicly displayed himself, his dress. So can you talk about these antagonistic relationships in the 30s and how relationships with enemies, not even frenemies, but enemies, influenced Churchill?
What's interesting about Churchill's vehement opposition to Nazi Germany is that, for the most part, he didn't focus on Hitler himself. Churchill was fascinated by many of the leaders he dealt with, but he offered very few comments on Hitler personally. What concerned him was that Hitler had got control of the most alarming, most dangerous war machine in Europe and arguably the world. Churchill had a deep suspicion of Prussian militarism. He saw Nazism as the latest vehicle for that essentially militaristic tendency in the German people. And he was determined to defeat Nazism. So he's not focusing on the evil of the man. He's focusing on the fact that this particular man has got control of this evil machine. Now, in the case of Gandhi, there are parallels, there are contrasts. Churchill, when we think of Churchill as a great war leader, we have to understand that he was fighting for, not just for Britain, but for the British Empire. The two things went together in his mind. That was what made Britain Great Britain. He saw Gandhi as one of the major global challenges to the greatness of Britain's empire, because Gandhi was, as you imply, he was in many ways a fake. He was a man who had been educated into the British Empire, had become a lawyer, had been trained at the Inns of Court, as they were called in London, which was for senior lawyers, for senior barristers. He dressed originally in upper-class dress, and then he turned all of that down and went off first to support the Indian community in South Africa and then back to his own home country in India, and very deliberately adopted the dress of the Indian peasants in solidarity to them. But from Churchill's point of view, this was precisely the opposite way that citizens of the British Empire should be operating. Instead of rising from barbarism to civilization, Gandhi was going the opposite way, from civilization to barbarism. Churchill he was a trained soldier, a graduate of Sandhurst Military Academy. He believed that in the basic principles of masculinity and martial arts. So Gandhi, dressing in an apparently feminine way with a loincloth, advocating pacifism, all these were complete anathema to Churchill's sense of what men, and particularly British men, should be doing. So not just because Gandhi wanted to end the British Empire in India, but because of all the values associated with his political stance, Churchill detested him in the same way as he detested Nazi Germany.
I'd like to look at that point a little bit more, because if there's a complaint that people have about Churchill today, it's from an anti-colonialist perspective, but they're doing so from the 21st century view, not from the argument that was taking place in the 1930s. And there was by no means unanimity in the 1930s. Churchill opposed the Government of India Act in 1935 to give autonomy to India. To help us better understand this context, could you describe this debate at the time and in more detail the argument that Churchill was putting forward? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
Are you a man who thinks about the Roman Empire at least once a day? According to a recent internet meme, you definitely do. And why shouldn't you? Here's a clip from Tom Holland talking about Rome at the very height of its power.
When tourists go to the Colosseum, they're not really going there, I suspect, most of them, because they're admirers of Flavian architecture. I suspect that they're going there because it's the kind of the shiver that you get of going to a place where blood sports have happened.
To listen to more of this discussion, check out the History Unplugged podcast on the podcast player of your choice.
Okay, so if you think of, if you like, the evolution of the British Empire from the late 19th century into the 20th century, an evolution from the empire to the term British Commonwealth, which has a different connotation. It suggests more of a sharing together rather than a one race or one country on top. You can see that process happening in the case of countries like Australia and New Zealand, which were settler colonies of Britain, which got their own devolved government in the early part of the 20th century. Same was true for Canada. These were countries that were self-governing in terms of domestic affairs, still relied on Britain as for defense. And the argument within the Conservative Party in the 1930s over India was whether India should go that same way. So there are figures like particularly Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister for much of the 1930s, believed that this was an important part of the process, that India was moving now into the position that Australia and New Zealand had assumed earlier in the 20th century. For Churchill, it was absolutely clear to him that Indians would never, in his view, be capable of self-government. And it was a complete fiction and a stupidity to suggest that. And so there was a fundamental division there. Churchill's attitude on racial questions was, particularly on an individual level, he could be very accepting, very appreciative of people. He came out very clearly in 1919 against the massacre of Indians at Amritsar and condemned that. And he said that was the kind of brutality that had no place in the British Empire. But in terms of the place of Indians, for Churchill, it was always that these were always going to be subordinate people within the British Empire. And that's where he had fundamentally disagreed with this idea of gradually devolving more power to India in the same way as had been given to Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the Commonwealth.
The dynamic between him and the World War II leaders is interesting. He has different views of his allies than, say, FDR. He largely distrusts Stalin when FDR saw him in the most positive light. He respected aspects of Mussolini until he turned on him and described him as a hyena. Can you describe his relations with other people in the alliance, with FDR, Stalin, enemies, Mussolini, and how this evolves over the wartime years?
Well, Churchill's attitude to Mussolini is shaped by Mussolini's role at the end of the First World War in stopping what seems to be the spread of Bolshevism from Russia, Lenin's revolution, across Europe. Remember, there are Bolshevik governments in parts of Germany and Hungary after the First World War. There's real fear that Italy is going to go the same way. And although Churchill does not approve of all Mussolini's thuggish methods, he is certainly hugely grateful that the Duce, as he became known, had held the line here and had kept Italy out of the Bolshevik camp. Mussolini was a very magnetic character, real charisma, and Churchill and indeed his wife, Clementine, both were taken by that in the 1920s. Churchill falls out with Mussolini when Mussolini throws his hand in with Hitler. Churchill had hoped that Mussolini might stay on the sidelines or even support the Allied cause, as was the case in the First World War. Once Mussolini goes with Hitler, then he goes down in Churchill's estimation and eventually, as you say, is regarded as simply a lackey of the Führer. The two most interesting people, in a way, from the point of view of allies, are two people that Churchill really would not have imagined having to work with in the 1930s, namely Roosevelt and Stalin, because Churchill, of course, assumes that the Second World War will go in roughly the same rhythm as the First. In other words, that the one thing you can guarantee is a firm Anglo-French front, Western front in Europe. That disintegrates within a week of his becoming prime minister in May 1940. It's clear that the French are going to be out of the war in a matter of weeks. Britain is going to have to find new allies, and it's at this point that Churchill turns his focus, his immense intent energy on first Roosevelt and then later on Stalin when Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Roosevelt is a man whose values are very different from Churchill's. Roosevelt is skeptical of the British Empire, feels that Winston is too much of a Victorian, as he puts it. On the other hand, there is a real sense of a shared cause here, certainly for the moment, and Churchill tends to invest that shared cause with a certain amount of romantic language and so on. He talks about this as the English-speaking peoples, the bond of language between the two countries, in ways that Roosevelt wouldn't do. But there's also for Churchill a huge admiration for Roosevelt because this is a man who's a paraplegic. It's very carefully concealed from the American public and the global public. Churchill can see it. He can see that this is a man who cannot walk unaided, can't even dress himself unaided. And yet this is a man who, however much difficulty he has every day in just the ordinary daily tasks, is able to offer inspiring leadership to his own country, the United States, and the world. And Churchill says on many occasions after the war, I really loved that man. And what it means there, I think, is admiration for men of courage, particularly military leaders, people who won awards for gallantry and so on, but also men of courage in a moral sense, in a personal sense. And Roosevelt has that in spades because of his fight against debilitation. In the case of Stalin, I would say that Churchill's antipathy and anxiety about the spread of Soviet communism is clear right from the Bolshevik Revolution, right from the 1920s. It's part of why he shifts from the Liberal Party to the Conservative Party, back to the Conservative Party again, because he sees the Conservatives as the only possible bastion against socialism and communism at home. He has a lot of skepticism of the Labour Party in the 1920s. And he is extremely concerned about the spread of communism globally in the 1930s. But what Churchill, that never changes. And there are times in the war when this fear wells up again about the possibility of Bolshevism spreading across Europe as a result of the Second World War. But Churchill controls that fear by the hope that he develops that he can actually manage Stalin, that he can build a relationship with Stalin. He visits Stalin. There are two meetings between the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. But Churchill has two other meetings with Stalin alone in Moscow. And out of those, right from the beginning, right from the first one in August 42, Churchill develops the idea that man to man, he can get on with Stalin, that Stalin is a man who does business. You may not always like the business, but you get a straight answer to a straight question, and that there is a mutual respect developing. And Churchill sees that against the background of, he believes, the fact that Stalin is also beholden to powers that be in the Kremlin, the Politburo, the marshals, whatever it is. They're rather shadowy forces in the background. And it's almost as if Churchill is casting Stalin as the moderate in this Soviet bestiary, if you like, the evil forces of Soviet communism. And this conception of Stalin as the moderate is one that simply bears no relationship to what we know now about Soviet politics in the Stalinist era. But it's part of Churchill's belief that he personally can hold back the tide of possible Soviet encroachment across Europe if he can carry on a working relationship with the Soviet leader. And that becomes, of course, part of why he justifies his second term in Downing Street in 1951 to 55, the hope that maybe he can resume the relationship that he felt had been interrupted, unfortunately, at the end of the Second World War. It's, in our mind now, a fallacy, I think, but it is a reflection of how his belief in his own personal powers of persuasion in dealing with leaders like Roosevelt or Churchill is why he is so important in his mind to retain as Britain's leader.
Churchill had a close circle that he relied on to inform him if he was blind to something or his judgment was skewed, which I think separates Churchill from a tin pot dictator that would never allow his judgment to be called into question. One of them was Clement Atlee, and he asked them to tell him when he was being a bloody fool and come back to the home front to focus on domestic affairs. But you note that Atlee, he's a labor politician from the 30s to the 50s, blinded Churchill to the waning dominance of the British Empire and the rising popularity of a post-imperial socialist vision of Great Britain. How does this dynamic play out, and why do you think Atlee blinded him to this?
Well, let's go back to their very early formative years because it's significant. Churchill's formative years were on the frontiers of the British Empire, fighting as a soldier on the northwest frontier of India, in the Sudan, in South Africa. That's where he developed his sense of the empire and its importance. Attlee's formative years were very different. He came from a prosperous legal family in London, but he got involved in social work settlements in the East End of London, in places like Limehouse. And he saw a completely different side of the British population. He saw young men who he thought of as having talent, but were doing most menial jobs. He was very keen to help them gain some sense of self-respect, to learn discipline, to engage in team sports and drill and things like that. And this brought Atlee into the Socialist Party, into the Labour Party in its early days. And he never lost that sense of commitment to, if you like, a different constituency from Churchill in a fundamental way. Atlee became Labour leader in the mid-1930s at a time when the Labour Party was pacifist. Atlee also had pretty utopian views about the League of Nations in those days, but he had also fought as a soldier in the First World War. He was in the rear guard at Gallipoli, So this was a man of courage who did share a belief in Britain's global role. It's just that he was definitely of the opinion that the global role had to be less imperial. Britain had to move with the times. And unlike Churchill, he saw India in the late 1920s. He could see the growing resentment of imperial rule. He could see the movements that were building up, and he felt was important to kind of preempt those threats and challenges. So Attlee's chance comes in 1940 when Churchill is made Prime Minister at the moment of great crisis, just as the German attack is beginning in France. It's clear this has to be a coalition government, and the Labour Party has the lion's share of seats, aside from Conservatives, in that government. And indeed, Atlee is one of the war cabinet, a key member of it. And what gradually happens, just because of Churchill's obsession with military matters and diplomacy, is that Atlee takes on more and more of the domestic side of the war effort. Had Neville Chamberlain lived, Chamberlain, a Conservative, would have done that, but he dies in 1940. Atlee takes on effectively that home front role, and he gradually puts the issues that matter to Labour at the heart of the agenda. It's not just that he is blindsiding Churchill on this. There's a clear shift of mood to the left during the Second World War in Britain. There's a feeling that this war has got to produce a better world. That better world had been promised in 1914-18. It had come to nothing. Homes fit for heroes and all those other broken slogans. Atlee and the Labour Party, and many more in the Conservative Party too, believe that there has got to be fundamental change. Atlee uses the time in office to actually school Labour politicians who'd had no experience of government before in what it was to run government ministries, to understand the complexities of policy. And he said, actually, in his later years, he said that, as it were, training of the Labour Party for government, post-war government, was actually one of his major achievements.
Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors. After Teddy Roosevelt's failed third-party presidential run, we thought that he would reassemble the Rough Riders for a final charge against the Germans in World War I by launching a cavalry attack against 50-caliber machine guns. Here's an interview with Bill Hazelgrove to look at this incredible story.
Teddy Roosevelt was one of these people who seemed indestructible. And that's why I think a lot of Americans wanted him to go, because in a way he was their Superman.
To listen to this full interview, check out the History Unplugged podcast on the podcast player of your choice. Well, we started this discussion looking at the difference between how Churchill consciously tried to see how posterity would remember him, and the gap between that and what sources can actually tell us about him. And in light of looking at how he was influenced by those in his orbit, how he successfully dealt with different people, how he may have unsuccessfully dealt with others, how do you think he should be remembered in light of all that?
Well, I'll preface my comment by just saying that, of course, Churchill was determined to, as it were, make the first strike on the verdict of history by writing that history himself. And he said that very often. And so in many ways, we have found it hard to see, we posterity have found it hard to see beyond the vision that he painted in his war memoirs, so 6 volumes of war memoirs. But I think personally that, and I'm talking both as a historian, but also, if you like, as a British citizen, I think that there is a danger of the admiration for Churchill, which is entirely justified, it has got a little bit too much in the way of seeing him as a man of his time, and also seeing the ways in which this country, Britain, has moved on, but needs to move on mentally from the era of the Second World War, and in particular of 1940, which Churchill described in the second volume of his memoirs. The title of that volume was Their Finest Hour, meaning the British people's finest hour. And in a way, it's become the way the British think about that heroic moment, our finest hour. I think that if we simply think that, then of course the logical extension of that is to say, well, then it must be all downhill ever since, if that's the British Empire's finest, British people, British Empire's finest moment. What I think we can say more judiciously as historians is this, that if Britain had collapsed or succumbed in 1940, the war and arguably the post-war world would have been very different, not least because it's very difficult to see how Franklin Roosevelt could have done anything but maintain a policy of hemisphere defense, Western Hemisphere defense, if there was no outpost of anti-Hitlerism in Europe. The fact that Britain hung on, what meant that Hitler was not able to dominate Europe in quite the same way as would otherwise have been the case. It also means that there is a base there in the British Isles for gradually building up a force to liberate the continent. D-Day could not have happened if all those troops and all those supplies were being shipped right across the Atlantic, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. The British base was significant. But what you'd have to say then is that, okay, Britain's survival in 1940 and defiance in 40 was hugely important for stopping Hitler from winning. In order that Hitler be defeated, the powers that mattered were the big continental powers, continent-wide powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who could deploy manpower and resources in a way that Britain simply could not do, even with the increasingly limited powers of the empire. So it seems to me that the distinction between stopping Hitler winning and actually being able to defeat Hitler is where we have to turn the page from Britain's defiance in 1940 to understanding the dawning era of the superpowers from 1941 to 45 and onwards.
Well, thank you for discussing all of this with us. There are a lot of new perspectives on what we think are well-known topics, and I like to flesh out these things. For listeners who want to check out David's book, the name of it is Mirrors of Greatness, Churchill and the Leaders Who Shaped Him. David, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
All right, that is it for today. If you would like to see show notes for this episode, along with all my others, go to parthenonpodcast.com. That's the name of the podcast network that I'm a part of, along with James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other great history shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, the two easiest ways to do so are to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. The second way is to join our membership program, and if you do so, you'll get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplugged. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.